Good morning, everybody, and it's wonderful to be here, and I'm delighted to have been invited to address such an important and critical conference for all of the institutions here, but also local authorities and other administrative bodies throughout the EU. I'm also very grateful that Carl is chairing, particularly since he got up very early this morning to come all the way from Latvia, where he was giving them a breakdown, I think their scorecard, as you call it, on how the Latvian presidency performed in relation to transparency. So I'm delighted that he's here. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Office of the European Ombudsman. It's quite a small office, just about 70 people. It's 20 years old this year. And I think its primary role, I suppose, is we're supposed to act as a watchdog over the European institutions, agencies and bodies, but I suppose its critical piece is to help to influence cultural change. So I'm not a court. 2 weeks ago, the ECJ got rid of the Safe Harbour Agreement by just banging its fist on the table. I don't have that power. My powers are recommendatory powers. The vast majority of recommendations are accepted. But I think over time we seek to influence cultural change, and I think particularly in the area of transparency, which is what I'm going to be majoring on this morning. So we get complaints from very many people, obviously from citizens, companies, NGOs, business associations. Anybody who is a citizen or a resident or who has any business at all with the European institutions can come and make a complaint or make an inquiry to my office, and the service is absolutely free. And one of the things that I have been majoring on since I became Ombudsman in 2013 is the power that I have of own initiative investigation or strategic investigation. And very many of the complaints, in fact the vast majority of the complaints that come to my office tend to be out of mandate, because it's generally citizens who are actually, the complaint is directed against their own domestic or member state administration. So we make sure that everybody who comes to the office is helped by instructing them or advising them as to where they could go to seek assistance. So when I was considering how I would make, I suppose, better use or more useful use of the limited resources that my office has, I looked at the power that I have of strategic investigation, and I have made a strategic decision to use that more often. So therefore, instead of just simply looking at the individual complaints, which of course is the bread and butter, if you like, of the organisation, and which we continue to do, I'm looking now at areas where I might find issues of systemic maladministration, and therefore by dealing with that I can deal with a lot of individual complaints and do something that is in the interest of not just a single complainant but within the wider public interest. Over the last 20 years, I think both my predecessors and I have found that one of the main concerns that citizens, businesses and others, NGOs that come to us looking for our assistance, is the lack of transparency within the EU administration. So that accounts for between 20 and 30% of all of our cases. The classic one would be the refusal to give access to EU documents. The other one, which Carl has referenced as well, would be lobbying transparency. And obviously nobody can spend too long in Brussels without becoming aware of the great strength and the great power of the lobbying industry. And one of the issues that we're constantly talking to the institutions about, and particularly the Commission, is how and why lobbying should be made more transparent. And one of the things I try and get across to them is the business case for doing so. EU decision making, and I'll talk about that later in relation to the trilogue process, and then revolving doors, which again Carl has references and which Transparency International has done a lot of excellent work on. And this, as Carl has explained, and as you all know, is when particularly senior officials, and perhaps typically from the Commission, who are in possession of a great deal of very important commercial knowledge, that's what it is, quite crudely, but we've been looking at that in relation to how the rules can be strengthened and how they can be enforced. So that is a very important piece of work. And again, when I speak to either commissioners or officials in relation to that, I make the case for doing so, because nobody working in an institution would allow somebody to come in and steal their files or hack into their computers and walk away with the information. But potentially that is exactly what happens when somebody in possession of a large amount of commercial information leaves an institution and goes across the road essentially to sell it. So again, lobbying, very important role in democracy. We have welcomed, and I think Transparency International has welcomed to some degree, the Transparency Initiative that was published by the President Juncker's Commission some time ago. And basically what they decided to do was that they would put online meetings that the President's cabinet, and I think the Secretary General of the relevant DG has with lobbyists. So if you go onto any of the Commissioner's websites or any of the Commission websites, you'll see, you know, DG, head of DG met with Mr. or Miss so-and-so from such and such a company. Now, what we've been saying, and I think TI have been saying it as well, is that it needs to go deeper, because very often the real lobbying doesn't take place at this level, it takes place at this level and this level, as you are all aware. And therefore it's very important that all of the lobbying interactions should be made visible. So therefore there should be publication of meeting with lobbyists other than simply at the top level. As you also know, the Transparency Register has yet to be made mandatory. We would support that, and we would also support it including the Council, because obviously lobbying doesn't just take place at institutional level, it takes place at member state level and with the permanent representatives and so on, and that's a very important piece of it. But when I spoke earlier about culture, I suppose that is particularly I think in relation to the Council, the difficult piece in relation to the Transparency Register, because not all countries, member states within the EU have been sensitised to this issue or are aware of the very vital and but often secretive role it plays in relation to the making of regulation and laws. So it could be very difficult for people to persuade certain member states that they should come on board the Transparency Register if they're not really culturally attuned to this. And that is a piece of work that has to be done. And I suppose in relation to my work of influencing, that's where the Ombudsman comes in. The EU Commission, we believe, has to set very, very high standards. It already has very high standards in very many areas, but it has to be setting examples for member states and other institutions. So this was a recent complaint that we dealt with. I published my recommendations in relation to this just a few weeks ago. There was a complaint from a number of NGOs, and they claimed that the Commission, contrary to the guidelines set by the World Health Organizations, had not revealed details of meetings with tobacco lobbyists as they should have done under these guidelines. So one of the very strong powers that I have is the power of inspection. So we were able to go in and look at the Commission files. And so what we found, it wasn't that the Commission had concealed its meeting, but rather that it hadn't proactively published details of its meetings, and that was an issue. And we believe that it should have done. And also, which was rather interesting, we learned from some of the officials within the Commission that they didn't accept or they didn't feel that lawyers were lobbyists. And as any of you who live and work in Brussels or elsewhere will know, lawyers most certainly are lobbyists, and that is the reason that they are very often hired by some of the top lobbying and public affairs firms in Brussels. So if you simply do a Google search and look at some of the public affairs organisations in Brussels, you'll see very often they are almost in headlights, advertising the fact that they have managed to get people previously involved at very high levels within the legal services of the institutions. And obviously they're very useful people to have, and very useful people when the Commission or the legislators are preparing to impose or create or produce whatever, publish a regulation that may have an impact on the people that they are working for. So among the recommendations was that lawyers should most certainly be recognised as lobbyists and dealt with under the lobbying guidelines. So that's a very important piece. And also, I think one of the things that I've noticed as well is that I'm not sure that people who work in institutions, agencies or elsewhere are aware of how lobbying actually works. I think some people have a very kind of, understandably perhaps, simplistic or underdeveloped idea of how lobbying works. They think that they queue up outside on a Monday morning and get their badges and go in and meet with Mr. So-and-so or Ms. So-and-so. But in fact, you know, a very simple Google search of lobbying tactics in Brussels will reveal the many and myriad ways they have of lobbying, of influencing, whether setting up front groups, creating expert groups, seeking in very many ways to influence in ways that aren't always immediately visible or obvious to the people that they are lobbying. And again, this is understandable because the Commission, contrary to what very many people like to think, is not a bloated, hugely staffed organisation. It's actually relatively small in comparison to EU member state administrations. And therefore, it doesn't have the time very often or the resources to do this. So one of the things that I've recommended informally is that people who come to work for the institutions and elsewhere indeed, people who are involved in public administration, should be given some instruction or some mentoring in relation to lobbying and how it works so that they can be aware of it. And I should point out, of course, that lobbying is an entirely legitimate activity because equally the members of the Commission or any public administration cannot expect to be experts on everything, and they have to be told what the real world effect of the regulation that they're proposing to bring in will have. But I think they have to be made very aware of who they're dealing with, what the end result is, and to be very clear about what their interaction is and to make it public. And another reason for making it public is that civil society actors can also help in this particular process by drawing attention to what is going on if necessary. So this was another own initiative investigation that I did into the transparency of TTIP. And this has been a very interesting issue. I'm sure all of you, many of you have followed it yourselves. And I know, again, Carl and his people have worked on this and commented on this. And I think the Commission in particular was surprised at the amount of civil society interest in all of this. And I think they had to very quickly get up to speed with the demands for transparency that were being placed on them in relation to this issue. I think in some ways they had a sort of an old-fashioned view of how trade talks should be negotiated, largely behind closed doors, with the results being produced at the very end and with very little opportunity for other actors to get involved. But I think when they did their public consultations, and particularly in relation to ISDS, the investor state, dispute resolution mechanism, I think they were quite astonished by how many people wanted to get involved in this. And I think that has led to really a culture shift within the Commission in relation to transparency. Now, I know Carl would feel that they probably haven't quite got there yet, but I think they've certainly made significant strides. And I think it was very noticeable last week when Commissioner Malmström released the latest EU trade policy. And she said it was going to be guided by three key principles. The first was efficiency, the second was transparency, and the third was values, I think. And I think the last trade policy, there was hardly any reference made to transparency. So over time, and thanks to the interventions of a number of actors, be it the European Ombudsman, NGOs such as Transparency International, civil society, other people, administrators themselves, this has led to a culture shift in relation to that. But again, it's not just because it's a virtuous thing to do. It's because, again, there is a business case for it. As we all know, there are pockets of resistance to TTIP for all sorts of reasons. And I think those people who want to get it across the line know that they possibly won't get it across the line if they are not more transparent in relation to it and if they don't seek to engage the trust of people on with whom this is going to affect. So sometimes the work of the European Ombudsman, unlike the work of the courts who can make very swift decisions and have them implemented, it's much more of a longer play. It's much more about influencing the culture. So again, the Commission has made changes, and I think in future the opening the negotiating mandate, which took I think over a year to be released, kicking and screaming, that in future they will be published. So there is a lot of work to be done, but certainly there's been a cultural shift. Okay, yeah. Okay, so this is the I suppose the latest strategic investigation that my office has started into trilogues, and I have to confess to my shame that when I came here a few years ago to seek the position of European Parliament, I only had a very vague idea of what trilogue was. And I guarantee you that if any of you go to your own home countries and ask even your most informed and best educated friends or relatives what trilogues are, you may well be met with very blank stares. Because the word is sort of a makey-uppy word, an invented word within the bubble. It doesn't appear, as far as I understand, in any piece of legislation, treaty, regulation, anywhere. What it is basically how the deal is done between the Commission, the Parliament and the Council. And it has been described as a trade-off between efficiency and accountability. And I suppose that's where the European Ombudsman comes in. Because it has been, in some ways, a victim of its own success, because I think 80% of regulations of EU laws are now got through in the first reading, so they don't have to go through second, third, and then on to the conciliation procedure. So it certainly has quickened up the pace at which regulation gets through the legislative process within the EU. But of course, many questions are asked, you know, if it is so fast, if it is done so quickly, if it is, or some of it done largely behind closed doors, then, you know, where does the transparency fit into that, and where does the treaty obligation for laws to be made in public and transparently, where does that fit in? So that's why I decided that we would begin an investigation into that. And what we're doing at the moment is what I describe as a mapping exercise. We've asked the Council and the Parliament and the Commission to respond to questions that we have about what they do make visible, what is transparent. And then we're going to look at a number of closed files and see what actually does come out. And then we'll do a public consultation. We'll ask people to, you know, say, well, you know, is it transparent enough? Where do you need more transparency? Are there any dangers in it becoming more transparency? What is the appropriate balance as between you know, efficient lawmaking, efficient negotiations, and that transparency and accountability piece? Everybody will have a different view as to where that point should be, and I think over time the point also changes. So that's what we're doing at the moment. So the closed files that we're looking at, Gundi, if you could just go back to one slide there. We're looking at the clinical trials regulation and the mortgage credit directive, not for any particular reason other than there's a particular public interest element to them that is interesting. So we're waiting for replies from the Council and the Parliament by the end of this month, and then we'll move to a public consultation. So that's just a flavour of the work we've been doing to date in relation broadly to transparency. So I'd very much welcome any questions or any observations that you have on our work. Thank you.